Hey, what's up everybody? Timothy here with Metarox, and we are going into part 4 of our War of the Spark Limited set review, this time looking at all of the black cards in the set and evaluating them from worst to best across all rarities. If you haven't checked out our previous videos, go ahead and check out those where we talked about all of the Planeswalkers and then covered white and blue cards so far going in WUBRG order. Before we get into the black cards, make sure you subscribe below, leave a comment if there's anything I missed on some of these cards, and find us on Twitter at MTG_Metarox. So with all that being said, let's go and jump into our first category, which are the sideboard cards, the build-around cards, the cards that are otherwise not really main deckable, and you want to leave them until you have the right type of deck or the right type of opponent to bring them in. First off, we're going to talk about Aid the Fallen. It's 1 and a black for a common sorcery. Choose one or both. Return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. Return a planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand. If this is only due in one mode, it's not really good. This isn't the day and age to be cast in Raised Deads, unless your cards are very, very good. If you have a super bomb that hits your graveyard, then Aid the Fallen can be an additional copy of that bomb once it's dealt with. Same goes for Planeswalker as well. But why I mention this is basically a build around is you want to make sure that you can get both the Planeswalker and the creature back, in which case this becomes a pretty good card. If you have the type of deck that is going to reliably get a Planeswalker into the graveyard, maybe a Planeswalker that can minus and kill itself off rather than just stick it on board with one loyalty, then this card's going to be quite good, and nearly every game you'll be able to get a creature in your graveyard. So I think this card is fine. Maybe you end up in some sort of self-mill deck, which really isn't supported here, but if you get both modes off of this, this card is quite good, and if you can only reliably build a deck that's going to get one mode or the other, then I don't think you should be running this card. Kaya's Ghost Form up next. It's a single black mana for a common aura. It enchants only a creature or planeswalker you control, and when that permanent dies or it's put into exile, you return it to the battlefield under your control. So clearly the kind of catch here, the joke here, is that you put this on one of your planeswalkers, and then when it dies, it comes back in with full loyalty, and you get to activate it right away. You do kind of have to engineer that situation, since a lot of the planeswalkers don't actually kill themselves by -in. And if you put this on a planeswalker, your opponent's not just going to freely kill it for you unless they can deal with it right away. I don't think this card is good. There are times where a card like this can go on one of your creatures, and then you can sacrifice it. There are some sacrifice outlets in the set, and then maybe you get to reuse that creature. But for the most part, this is going to be the type of card you stick on a creature, and then your opponent either bounces your creature or deals with it in response, or they just don't care about it anymore. You have to put this on a pretty reliable card or a pretty impactful card for it to come back and matter that much. And it also doesn't work on like amass tokens or anything like that. So I'm not a huge fan. Also note, just kind of a rules interaction, that this can only enchant your permanent. So if your opponent takes control of the permanent that has Kaya's Ghost Form on it, it will actually drop off of that creature, and it will not come back when you get that creature back at the end of turn. Not sure how many threat and effects are in this format, but thought I would just mention that. Bolas's Citadel, nice little rare here, sitting in our build-around category. This is a complicated card. It's 3 black, 6 mana total. It is a rare legendary artifact. It allows you to look at the top card of your library, and you can pay that card's mana cost in life to cast it or play it off the top of your library. In which case you don't have to pay its actual mana cost. So if you have a 5-drop sitting on top of your deck, you can pay 5 life to cast that card off the top. You can also play lands for free, but only 1 land per turn still. And then the last ability here says sacrifice 10 non-land permanents. Each opponent loses 10 life. It's not very often in a game of Limited that you get to 10 non-land permanents. I mean, think about if you played Rivals of Ixalan and the Ascend mechanic. It wasn't every game that you even got to 10 permanents total, including your lands. So I'm imagining Bolas's Citadel is not going to work out. It is a build-around card. If you have a bunch of life gain, which there's not a ton of, but there is a lot of incidental life gain in this set. If you end up with a bunch of life gain, then maybe Bolas's Citadel can be a card advantage machine, a la Frenzied Experiment or something along those lines, but I don't think that's going to pan out for you very well. Also, if you have just a bunch of cheap spells, if your deck like curves out at 3, maybe you put a Bolas's Citadel in there and you can chain off enough spells to make this matter. But for the most part, I don't think this is a limited card. This is a janky constructed card, or, you know, a card that's going to disappoint people over and over again in Commander. But for limited, I would say stay away from Bolas's Citadel. And we have Price of Betrayal, which is one in a long line of very good black removal spells. This one's very situational, though. It's a single black mana, it is an uncommon sorcery, and it says remove up to 5 counters from target artifact, creature, player, or opponent. In limited, the opponent part doesn't matter, but that deals with like infect counters, experience counters, so on and so forth. I don't know why you're removing infect counters from your opponents, but you have that option. This is a Planeswalker killer, essentially. Price of Betrayal is a sideboard card for sure. You can include this in your main board, and I think nearly every single deck you play against is going to have 1 or 2 targets, since everybody's probably going to have at least 1 or 2 Planeswalkers in their deck. But for the most part, if they don't play that Planeswalker, or, you know, you just don't care about killing that Planeswalker, then Price of Betrayal can sit in your hand not doing anything, and I would much rather have one of the reliable removal spells that's always going to have a target, rather than Price of Betrayal, which may not have a target. Also worth noting that this can kill armies, since armies are base 0/0s and their power and toughness is made up entirely out of +1/+1 counters. You can use this to pick off an army that has 5 or less +1 counters on it. Using this just to remove a bunch of counters from a creature that's like a 2/2 that maybe picked up 2 counters is not very good, and it's a sorcery, so you can't use it as a combat trick either. Board this in against Planeswalker heavy decks or people who have a bunch of amass cards in their deck. Otherwise, don't play it. Next up, our filler category. These are the cards that you'll put in your deck more often than not, but you're not super happy about them, and you don't have to pick early picks on them. You usually hope to wheel them in your boosters. First up, Davriel's Shadow Fugue. 3 and a black for a common sorcery. Target player discards 2 cards and loses 2 life. Now, 2 life to make this 1 more mana than a typical Mind Rot is not where I want to be. I don't care too much about the extra 2 life tacked onto it. If you really, really want to Mind Rot, your opponent's playing an extremely controlling deck with a bunch of expensive cards, then you can go ahead and play this. But it's a pretty bad card. In fact, 3 mana for an opponent to discard 2 cards is not really where I want to be either. And the 2 life doesn't justify the extra mana you're paying for this. That being said, Davriel's Shadow Fugue is a 2-for-1, as all Mind Rots typically are, but you have to recognize that sometimes you draw this really late in a game when your opponent's hand is empty and it loses a ton of its value. There are times where you cast a Shadow Fugue or a Mind Rot type effect, and it just gets your opponent and basically is the turning point in that game, but I don't see that on a 4-mana version of this card. Toll of the Invasion is 2 and a black for a common sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, and they discard that card, plus amass 1. I've actually come around a little bit on these non-situational discard spells. Again, 3 mana, sorcery speed, 1-for-1 discard is not great. It doesn't affect the board. It makes it so that your opponent loses a card but never spent mana on that card in the first place, so it's not like you're really getting that much of a mana advantage. But it can snipe a key piece out of your opponent's hand, and it does come with a 1/1, sometimes a +1/+1 counter. I mentioned Amass a lot in the previous video, so if you really want to know how I feel about Amass in general as a mechanic, I suggest going and watching the blue video, and I'll talk about it when it's relevant here. Toll of the Invasion, it's not great, but it does give you the option to peel an important card out of your opponent's hand and gives you a little bit of upside on top of it. And yeah, the cards like this have never been amazing, but they've been main deckable when they have some sort of upside on them. And I think this is fine. I wouldn't play more than 1, and I'm not really looking to pick this card up, but if it makes my main board, I'm not super disappointed about it. We have Liliana's Triumph next in the cycle of cards that care about the Planeswalker in the name. This is 1 and a black for an uncommon instant. Each opponent sacrifices a creature. If you control Liliana, congratulations, you win the game, but also an opponent discards a card. Clearly, that's a nice little upside there, but if you already have Liliana, that's 6 mana, you're casting Liliana's Triumph way before you cast Liliana in a game of Limited. Now, this card is fine, but Edict effects are often overrated. If you draw this in the early game and it snipes your opponent's 2-drop, then you're trading a 2-mana removal spell for a 2-mana creature of your opponent's choice, and that's fine. A lot of times this isn't going to get the creature you want. If your opponent has a big creature or a big army on board and then they have a bunch of little guys, then Liliana's Triumph is actually very bad since your opponent will just sacrifice their worst creature. So if you have the opportunity to cast the Triumph and get a decent creature out of it, you should, but this is much worse than a lot of the removal we'll see later on in this video. Command the Dreadhorde. Alright, here's one that I would love to hear people's opinions about because I don't think it's amazing and limited, but it surely has a bunch of potential to just blow a game wide open. So it's got kind of like the potential bomb out, but for the most part I think it's going to play very poorly, but I might be just underrating it. The card in question here is 4 black, 6 mana total for a rare sorcery. Choose any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers in graveyards, that includes anyone's graveyard. Command the Dreadhorde deals damage to you equal to the total CMC of those cards, and then you put all those cards onto the battlefield. So you get to reanimate as many things as you want, including planeswalkers from any graveyards, but you take a bunch of damage equal to the CMC of those cards. And that last part is what makes me think this is not going to be the bomb I want it to be. It's not like you can just reanimate your opponent's 6-drop and reanimate your 6-drop and take 12. I mean, maybe you can do that, and maybe you win the game because you did that, but if you're under any sort of pressure, that's not really a game-winning line. Where this is good is in decks that can gain a bunch of life, or decks that can stabilize the board early on, kill all of your opponent's creatures, and then maybe reanimate a bunch of them. Or in the third situation, I could see this being the top-end card in a deck with a bunch of aggressive little creatures, 1-drops and 2-drops, and then you use Command the Dreadhorde to maybe bring back 3, 4, maybe even more than that, right? So there's a lot of potential here, but I think if you just look at this card and you say, wow, it's amazing, you're thinking about EDH for some reason, that doesn't always apply to limited, and there are games where you're just getting completely hosed and beat down, and you can't afford to pay a card that stabilizes by losing you a bunch of life. So I'm not sure. Maybe this deserves to be a lot higher on the list. I have a feeling that it's going to play out very well in certain matchups, and a lot of times it's just going to be a dead card that you can't afford to cast. And if you're only getting back a single permanent with this, I think there's a better version of that card coming up here in a minute. So you kind of got to maneuver yourself in a situation where this is great, but I will recognize that there are some times that this will be the game-winning card that you cast. Banehound, this card is horrendous. It's 1 black for a 1/1 common Nightmare Hound. It has lifelink and haste, and people are going to love this card, and they're going to play it on turn 1 and attack you, and you're going to be minorly annoyed, and then you're going to beat them because they're playing Banehound. Remember Thurston Shade from the last set, Ravnica Allegiance? That card was awful, but people love casting Thurston Shade because it starts dealing damage on turn 1. It feels like you're curving out and doing busted things, and it even had an activated ability. Banehound is worse than Thurston Shade, but the reason it's not completely unplayable is because there are some +1 counter synergies in this set, and if you can manage to get a bunch of counters on a Banehound, then sure, it's a playable card. But you basically got to guarantee that you're curving Banehound into something that puts counters on it, and then into things that proliferate those counters. Otherwise, if you're just playing Banehound because you want to get in on turn 1, and you think that feels great, then you can do better. Your opponent just plays a 2/2 on turn 2, and suddenly Banehound doesn't do anything. It might have gotten in 1-2 damage, you might have lifelinked a little bit, but it drops off so profoundly that I would ignore this card basically altogether until I see some sort of deck that really needs a 1-drop. Dreadmalkin? Dreadmalkin. Okay, 1 black for Dreadmalkin. It's 1/1, uncommon, zombie cat. It has menace, great on your little 1-mana 1/1s, and it has 2 and a black, sacrifice another creature or planeswalker, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Dreadmalkin. So 1 mana 1/1 menace, not a good card. That's probably worse than Banehound. Honestly, I would rather have lifelink than menace on my 1/1, but there is some real power in that activated ability. Being able to turn your creatures that don't matter anymore, or your planeswalkers that have kind of exhausted their abilities into additional counters on your menace creature is fine. Plus, there are some things that trigger when they die. Maybe you can eat a small army and make another army and keep some sort of chain going. This card could get big. It requires a lot to be going right, or a very particular board state for it to be that massive. But if you sacrifice 2 things, this is a 5/5 menace, and that's nothing to scoff at, which I think is reflected in this being an uncommon rather than a regular common. If you need a sack outlet, this is probably one of your only options, and on its own, it's not very good, but in the right sort of deck, I could see Dread Malkin doing some work. Alright, moving into our average mid-pick category, these are cards that I'm happy to have in my deck, but I'm not spending my first early picks on them. Hopefully they will, but a lot of them will not. First one is Vizier of the Scorpion, 2 and a black for a 1/1 uncommon zombie wizard. When it enters the battlefield, amass 1, and zombie tokens you control have Death Touch. So I mentioned this with the blue fly-in version of this card in the previous video that zombie tokens are basically just armies in this set, with the exception of the zombies that Liliana makes, and also Aketra. Aketra makes zombies, but those are mythic rares we're talking about. For the most part, when it says zombie tokens, we're talking about armies. If this said armies you control have Death Touch, it would essentially be the same thing for the purposes of this limited set. This card's good. It's a 3-mana 1/1 that makes a 1/1 Death Toucher, and if that 1/1 Death Toucher trades off and you get to amass again, your new army or your previous army, whatever armies you have on board, they're all going to be Death Touchers, which makes them good attackers and good blockers. And I tend to like that if you're playing a grindier controlling game. The awkwardness of this card is, let's say you attack with your Death Touch an army, or you block with it, and then your opponent responds by killing the Vizier of the Scorpion in the middle of combat. Your army no longer has Death Touch, and that might be a blowout in your favor, or against you, I should say. But Vizier of the Scorpion provides, 2 relevant bodies if it's the only thing on board, a 1/1 and a 1/1 Death Toucher, and it has the potential to make additional Death Touchers. I think if you have a Vraska in your pool, you want this card a little bit more, and if you have a lot of amass cards, then Vizier of the Scorpion is fine. It's about on par with a lot of the other black creatures we're going to see in a minute that just make army tokens when they come into play or when they die. But yeah, I think this card is good, solid, kind of middle-of-the-pack filler for your black decks. Lazotep Behemoth, a vanilla here, 4 and a black for a 5/4 common zombie hippo with great flavor text. Yeah, this is a pile of stats. It's not great. Maybe it should be a little bit lower because cards like Fire Elemental tend to be like the last card in a pack, but you can't ignore 5 power on a 5-mana creature forever. And if your opponent has Planeswalkers, this basically kills them in one hit for the majority of Planeswalkers. So it's not a card that can be ignored, and I think, power on creatures is something that's going to be very relevant in this set. That being said, as I've mentioned in previous videos, the removal in this set is very good, so there's a limitation on how many expensive creatures you can play without having your opponent just destroy all of them with more efficient answers. So this isn't a card I'm clamoring to have in my deck, but if I'm in need of a 5-drop, I think Lazotep Behemoth will do just fine. Lazotep Reaver is up next, 1 and a black for a 1/2 common zombie beast. When it enters the battlefield, amass 1. So you're getting 2 power and 3 toughness worth of stats for 2 mana, and I think that's fine. This is better cast, I think, early on to get an army going, and then follow up with bigger amass cards to kind of give those amass cards pseudo-haste on the army you already have. It doesn't really matter which order, though. If you play the Reaver after a different amass card, then you're just adding a counter to that amass army, and you get to attack with basically 1 point of haste. So the ordering doesn't matter too much, but Reaver's a solid 2-drop that can fill a curve out, gives you 2 bodies for any sacrifice effect you might have, and I think it's just a solid playable that you'll be happy to run maybe 1 or 2 of in your deck. Herald of the Dreadhorde, another amass creature here. This one is 3 and a black for a 3/2. It is a common zombie warrior, and when it dies, you amass 2. I like this quite a bit. It's a solid body. I've said in a previous video that 3-mana 3/2 is kind of filler, and 4-mana 3/2 is a little bit worse than that, but you're getting something when this dies, so you're happy to trade it off or sacrifice it to some other effect like the Dread Malkin. And then you get to leave behind hopefully a 2/2, but sometimes 2+1/+1 counters on an army you already have is pretty good too. So I think this, again, is kind of middle of the pack card. I wouldn't expect to see this card wheel too often, since I think it gives you enough value on your 4-drop that you're happy to play it, but it's also not something that you have to clamor for. You have to snap up early, because it's not exactly a sign that black's open. It's just a good, efficient 2-for-1 on a reasonable body. Shriek Diver is next. 2 and a black for a 2/1 common zombie bird warrior. It has flying, and for 1 colorless mana, you can give it haste until end of turn. Only relevant if you draw it past turn 3, but if you curve into this on turn 3 and you play it, that ability is basically null and void. Unless your opponent gains control of it, they can give it haste or something, but mostly irrelevant. We saw this card, I want to say in Amonkhet, there was a card called Blighted Bat, and it was basically the same exact thing, but the zombie synergies mattered more in Amonkhet than they do here, since zombie tokens tend to be the cards that have synergies in this set. So Shriek Diver is basically just 2 power worth of flying for 3 mana. That 1 toughness does matter a bit. It's a little bit punishable by some of the creatures and effects in this format. So this takes a little bit of a hit, whereas like a 3 mana 2/2 flyer would be slightly better. But evasive flying damage on a 3-drop is fine. And even though this card's not amazing, it will get in there and it's just reasonable to put in your deck. Thorin's Thirst is reprinted here. It's double black, black for a common instant. Pretty simple. Deals 3 damage to target creature. You gain 2 life. I'm sorry, it deals 2 damage to target creature, and you gain 2 life. I think I said 3, but it's 2 damage, you gain 2. This is a fine card. It's an instant as well, so there's some potential there. It's going to be good at dealing with early game threats, but it's not one of the premier removal spells for black because it doesn't deal with bigger things. Also can't hit planeswalkers, which is relevant in this set, whereas a lot of the new burn can actually hit planeswalkers or be directed at them. So Thorin's Thirst is going to be a pretty good card to deal with aggressive decks, pretty good at stabilizing early on and making sure you don't die to some onslaught of creatures, and it's not too hard to trade this up for a 3 or 4 mana creature sometimes, so I think you'll be happy playing a number of Thorin's Thirsts, but it's not a removal spell that you want 4 copies of in your deck. Vraska's Finisher is up next. 2 and a black for a 3/2 common Gorgon Assassin. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. So another 3 mana 3/2, just a filler card with a minor upside to it, but the upside's fine, right? That effect won't come up too often, and once the set goes on for a little while, it's going to be more telegraphed that people are going to basically ignore this effect and get got by it the first couple of times. If you're making really bad attacks into your opponent, and your opponent's kind of questioning what's going on, and maybe you just attack a 1/1 into a 3/3, or you attack a bunch of guys into a planeswalker, but you're throwing away attackers, I would think that there's a Vraska's Finisher coming, but it'll probably get people the first couple of times. That being said, you can just drop it as a 3 mana 3/2 if your opponent doesn't take the bait, or your opponent blocks in a way where creatures just trade off anyway, and it'll be a fine little curve filler. It's basically a low pick card that has some upside that'll get people some amount of the time, but that doesn't make it too much better than just an average card. Bond of Revival is up next. The black bond, if you will, is 4 and a black for an uncommon sorcery. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste until your next turn. I don't know why it can't just have haste, but whatever. Yeah, so a reanimation type effect that only affects your graveyard and lets that creature attack right away seems fine to me. It's not amazing. It's a little less flexible than something like Rise from the Grave, which can target creatures out of your opponent's graveyard, but this can give you a surprise attack that your opponent wasn't expecting. It is a little bit weird, or a little bit worse off, that it has to target something in your graveyard, and there are often times that you don't want to cast this on anything that's in your graveyard. If your opponent has dealt with your big bomb or something like that by keeping it on board and making it irrelevant, and it never actually dies, then Bond of Revival takes a little bit of a hit. It's also a lot better in decks like green-black, where green tends to have bigger creatures. The bigger the creature you get back with Bond of Revival, the better. In something like, let's say, blue-black, which tends to have a lot of defensive creatures and not a lot of stats, this card loses a lot of its value. So I would look to stick this in a deck that has a bunch of bigger creatures, or maybe big evasive creatures that are worth giving haste to, and play it in those decks. But it's the type of card I typically don't want more than one of, if I want one at all. 3, 2, 1. Next up is Deliver Unto Evil, 2 and a black for a rare sorcery that says, choose up to 4 target cards in your graveyard. If you control a Bolas Planeswalker, congratulations, you win the game, but you also return the cards to your hand. Otherwise, an opponent chooses 2 of them, you leave those cards in your graveyard and you put the rest into your hand, and then Deliver Unto Evil exiles itself. So there's a little bit going on here. For the most part, if you have 4 cards to target, then your opponent's going to choose 2 of them to put back in your hand. If you have less than 4 cards, this card gets a lot worse because your opponent chooses 2 to keep in the graveyard. Let's say you target 3 cards, you're only going to get 1 of them. Your opponent chooses 2 to keep in the graveyard, you get the last one, right? Pretty straightforward, but this card I don't think is amazing. At worst, it's always going to draw you 2 cards if you target up to 4 cards. And it's usually going to get you 2 spells back, but since your opponent has control over what you're getting back, you can't just be like, alright, I picked my bomb, this removal spell, and 2 little crapper cards. They're going to give you the crapper cards, and you're not getting your bomb or your spell back. I don't think this card is amazing unless the quality of the cards in your deck is really, really high. If all of your cards are like slam dunk, 4 out of 5s or higher, then this card's going to be really good because it's always going to give you valuable cards back. But in the average deck, this is sometimes going to whiff and sometimes won't be castable at all. Especially in the early game, I would rather have a Divination that just draws me 2 cards because you can't really cast Deliver Unto Evil early in the game. Your graveyard just won't be full enough. If you have a Bolas Planeswalker and you have Deliver Unto Evil, then triple thumbs up, congratulations. But for the most part, I think this is just a Divination that's sometimes worse than a Divination earlier in the game and sometimes better than that later in the game. Charity Extractor is 3 and a black for a common Human Knight. It is a 1/5 with lifelink. Pretty simple card. I don't think this card's, bonkers or anything, but it stabilizes quite well and holds off 1 toughness creatures from attacking into you. If you're looking to play a defensive long game, then you would probably play exactly 1 Charity Extractor. Outside of that, I think this card's a little bit on the passable side. Duskmantle Operative, 1 and a black for a 2/2. Good stat line, I think, in this format. I've talked about how I like 2-mana 2/2s, with upside especially. This one's a common human rogue, and it says it can't be blocked by creatures with power 4 or greater, so obviously going to be better against certain matchups than others. Probably not at its best against a blue deck that can play a bunch of small defensive creatures that don't have a lot of power, but a little bit better against, say, black or green decks that are going to generally have bigger power creatures. I think this card's fine. 2-mana 2/2 is a stat line that you're going to want on a decent number of creatures in your deck just to be able to pressure your opponent's planeswalkers if they play an early one. And I think you can do worse than Duskmantle Operative, even though the upside on this one's a little bit finicky and won't come up too often. Tithe-Bearer Giant is up next. I kind of like the art. It's pretty sweet, right? It's a 5 and a black for a 4/5 common giant warrior, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose a life. This is a giant Blade Juggler, right? Blade Juggler ended up being one of the best commons, if not, maybe the best common in the previous set, Ravnica Allegiance, and that was because of its ability, not because of its stat line. Even for 5 mana, you would be happy casting a Blade Juggler. This is 1 more than a full cost Blade Juggler, but gives you a lot more stats, right? A 4/5 for 6, that leaves a lot to be desired, but the ability is a nice one to have on kind of your big top-end creature. You can't afford to just run 4 or 5 of these in your deck like you would a Blade Juggler, but you can afford to run 1, maybe 2 as your top-end cards, and I think it'll play off just fine. Unlikely Aid. Great art. 1 and a black for a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn. I'm not saying you should run a bunch of Unlikely Aids, and it is just an average card at best, but I do like when my combat tricks save my creature and give me power, meaning that I can trade up a little guy for a bigger guy. Especially in decks that have a bunch of 2 power, maybe 3 power creatures, you can use this to trade up for your opponent's 4 or 5 drops. And you can use it as like a Lazotep Playdin to just counter a removal spell. Your opponent tries to burn your creature, you cast Unlikely Aid to make it indestructible, and you basically use this as a counter spell that gives you a temporary power boost for the turn. It's not insane, it's not as good as like Giant Growth, which we'll get to in green, but it's a fine card and you can include one in any deck that's interested in attacking your opponent. Vampire Opportunist is the type of card that looks like it's overcosted and bad, but hey, it's a good test for, the vanilla creatures in this format. It's 1 and a black for a 2/1, a little bit worse than a 2/2, but 2/1's not too far off. It's a common vampire, and for 6 and a black, you can activate it, and each opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. That's a very steep cost, but don't be confused by the steep cost. It's already playable as a vanilla creature in this format. It trades off for your opponent's 2/2s, and then it has a relevant late game mana sink, although I don't think this is the type of mana sink that's going to straight up win you games. It's also not a card that can be completely ignored in like a stalled out game, so it's fine. I'm not picking this over most of the other 2/2s in this format, but if you need a 2-power creature for 2 mana to fill the curve, this one gives you something on top of that. Yeah, it's fine. You don't want these highly, but you will play one. All right, moving into the exciting cards, the above average early picks. We're going to see a lot of removal in this category because black has a lot of great removal, but these are cards that you're looking to pick up, maybe not first pick over some great bomb, but second through fourth pick, and they basically never wheel in the packs. Eternal Taskmaster is our first one, 1 and a black for a 2/3 uncommon zombie that enters the battlefield tapped, but whenever it attacks, you may pay 2 and a black to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. That's a nice little ability on top of a 2-mana creature. Obviously, the coming in tapped makes this a lot worse later in the game, especially if you're doing a lot of blocking and your opponent's being super aggressive, but this is a good attacker that can give you value later in the game. Of course, later in the game, a 2/3 is more likely to trade off, but that seems fine to me. You can even loop Eternal Taskmasters with each other if that gives you any sort of value, but this is a straight value creature, and I'd probably be happy to play as many of these as I have in my deck, especially the grindier the game goes. This is going to be very good against those decks. Nixilis's Cruelty is one of our good removal spells. It's 2 and a black for a common instant. It has an art of Nixilis Torture and a Pigeon, and it says target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. If that creature dies this turn, exile it instead. This is a fantastic removal spell. We actually don't see removal like this at common basically ever anymore. I'm thinking of cards like Lash of the Whip and Throttle and even Flatten, which were all good removal spells in their individual formats, which gave -4/-4 and cost more mana than this. This is just hyper efficient removal spell. You will take this very early on and you will take it as a sign that black is open. Plus, it's pretty splashable with just a single black blip in the mana cost. So you will play as many of these as you can get, and it is probably one of the premier removal spells in the format as far as commons go. Dreadhorde Invasion, a card that I talked about in another video, but this card is fantastic, I think, although pretty bad when behind. It's 1 and a black for a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life and you amass 1. So just to kind of reiterate on that, if you don't already have an army on board, you're going to lose a life and make a 1/1 army. If you already have an army on board, you're going to lose a life and put a counter on the army you already have. There's an upside here, too, that says whenever a zombie token you control with power 6 or greater attacks, it gains a lifelink until end of turn. So because of that last clause, your opponent can't ignore Dreadhorde Invasion, and it actually gets a lot better the more amass you have. If you can curve this into some extra amass cards and make that 6/6 early on, you can offset the life you're losing from Dreadhorde Invasion and just steal a game completely. Lifelink on a 6/6 is no joke. Of course, armies have basically a huge downside to them in that if you amass and you use a bunch of your amass resources over time to make one huge army and then your opponent removes it, it takes away that whole army all at once and all of the amass basically goes with it. Dreadhorde Invasion has the upside, of course, though, that if an army is dealt with, you get to start a new one right away. This seems really good, and it seems like an insane 2-drop play. If you play this on turn 2, you might be able to just win a game with this and maybe a couple removal spells and a couple other creatures. If your opponent's playing a deck that doesn't have a lot of removal, they're going to be in trouble when this card hits on turn 2, but that's the turn 2 dream situation. A lot of times you'll draw this on like turn 6 or 7 when you're getting beat down by a fast deck or a big creature deck, and this card loses a lot of its value, and you can't even afford to lose the life. It's also a fine chump blocker. You make a 1/1 every turn. That creature can block. You make another 1/1. So if you're able to use that zombie token for value, maybe you sacrifice it to a Dread Malkin and you just keep getting another one every single turn. Maybe that's a line of play that leads to some victories. But for the most part, I'm interested in slamming this on turn 2, trying to get that token up to 6 power as quick as possible, and trying to race the opponent and make it so that they can't race back because of the lifelink. The Elder Spell. This is a situational removal spell that I think you mainboard and then you take it out when it's not good rather than the other way around. In this case, you're paying black for a rare sorcery that says destroy any number of target planeswalkers. Choose a planeswalker you control and put 2 loyalty counters on it for each planeswalker destroyed this way. This card seems like it has the potential to just lead to some really ridiculous stories, right? Your opponent has 2 planeswalkers on board, you have 1, you cast the Elder Spell, you kill both of their planeswalkers for 2 black mana, and you get to put 4 loyalty counters on your planeswalker and just activate it a bunch of times. That's not too much of a stretch to imagine that happening. A lot of times you'll just play black and kill this, only planeswalker your opponent has, but there's no cost to that, right? Even if you don't get to put loyalty counters on your planeswalker, even if you don't get to go hog wild and destroy 3 of your opponent's planeswalkers, if you can get at least 1 planeswalker out of the deal with the Elder Spell, it's quite good. I mentioned this with, I want to say the card is Prison Realm, the white Oblivion Ring in this set at Uncommon. I mentioned that when your opponent resolves a planeswalker, they're going to get value off of it right away because they get to activate right away. So even when you kill that planeswalker with a 1-for-1 removal spell, they've already gotten something off of it. So maybe the Elder Spell takes a hit there, but this can do something that a lot of other cards in this set are just completely not even close to doing, and that's being able to deal with multiple planeswalker threats at the same time. So if you see this in a pack, I'm probably first picking it, maybe not over a, super strong removal spell or a very powerful creature or something along those lines, but I'm always going to main deck it, and then if I have the suspicion my opponent's just not playing planeswalkers, or maybe they only have 1 and I'm not too worried about it, I will board it out rather than board it in against those decks that do have a bunch of planeswalkers. Bleeding Edge is up next. 1 black for an uncommon sorcery. Up to 1 target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Amass 2. So it's a little bit restrictive on the mana cost, but this is again another good removal spell. Just like Sorin's Thirst, this one doesn't deal with everything. It doesn't kill your opponent's Lazotep Hippos, right? It doesn't kill their 3 toughness or above creatures, but it will curve out nicely, kill their 2-drop, kill potentially their 3-drop, and leave you behind a 2-drop or 2 counters on your army. It is a sorcery, so there's no, sneaking in a 2/2 as a blocker, but it is quite efficient for what it does, and it's a nice little 2-for-1. When you resolve this card and it kills something, it's going to feel like a Ravenous Chupacabra, and that's saying quite a bit. I think you'll play as many of these as you can, and there are situations where your opponent just won't even have a creature on board, and you're allowed to cast this just to amass 2 if that's the right thing to do. So be on the lookout for those situations, although most of the time you want to kill your opponent's creature with this card. Spark Harvest, another removal spell. It's a single black mana for a common sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature or pay 3 and a black. So if you're not sacrificing a creature, you're playing 5 mana total, 3 black, and the effect you get out of that is destroy target creature or planeswalker. So, your 5 mana sorcery destroy target creature is usually a pretty playable, decent card in limited. Sorcery makes it a little bit worse, but it's fine, right? And then being able to kill a planeswalker is obviously a nice little touch to that gives it a little bit more reach in what it can deal with. And then, of course, you have the Bone Splinters effect on it, which allows you to sacrifice maybe an irrelevant creature or a 1/1 token or something that you're just not using effectively in the game to just take anything out. And you can't ask for much more efficiency. Sacrificing a creature is a real cost, right? I'm not just saying you can run this in any deck or your 10 creature deck and sacrifice your 5/4 to kill your opponent's creature, but it's an option, and that makes it a little bit better. But for the most part, think of this as a 5 mana removal spell that sometimes becomes a 1 mana removal spell, not the other way around. Spark Reaper is up next. It's 2 and a black for a 2/3 common zombie, and for 3 mana, you can sacrifice a creature or planeswalker to gain a life and draw a card. This is the type of effect I would expect to see on an uncommon most of the time, which is why I have this in the early pick category, because having a common with this sort of ability that can potentially draw, 2-3 extra cards in a game is quite strong. Even though the body's not great, the activated ability is expensive, and you have to have expendable creatures to make this really good. I think the total effect here is something that you're happy to have in the kind of filler commons of your deck. It's not going to steal the game and run away with it. There's not a lot of token generation in this set to really make this an engine card, but it's a nice way to make it so that if your opponent, sends removal at one of your creatures, then you can maybe get value out of that creature. So I like this. I do think it's quite strong. It's maybe a little bit lower than like a second or third pick, but I could see this being a sign that black is open, and I could see it being one of the premier black creatures in this set. All right, our bombs and our first picks, actually a couple to talk about this time. It's not just the god, although, spoiler alert, the god is here. Let's go and talk about them. So we've got first up Massacre Girl. Not Judith, guys, sorry. It's 3 black for a 4/4. It is a rare legendary human assassin, and she has Menace. On top of that, she has this really sweet ability that says when she enters the battlefield, each other creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. And then she has this trigger that's still part of her enter the battlefield trigger that says whenever a creature dies this turn, each creature other than Massacre Girl gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So there's this kind of chain reaction effect where if her -1/-1 kills a creature, then everything will get another -1/-1, and then if another creature dies, everything will get -1/-1 again, and that'll just keep happening for the turn she enters the battlefield. Once the turn ends, that effect is no longer in effect. Once her ETB has resolved and the turn passes, if a creature dies, they will no longer get -1/-1. That's not a static ability. It is part of the same enter the battlefield trigger. So it's a little bit weird in the way that it functions, but it's quite good. It's a nice way to kind of take out an army of small creatures. No pun intended on army. But if your opponent has a bunch of 1-drops and 2-drops and 2 toughness, 3 toughness creatures, Massacre Girl can kill basically an entire board. And she doesn't affect herself either, so she's never dying to this own trigger. And then what you get left behind is a 5-mana 4/4 Menace, which is quite a strong card and something that I'd be happy to play as basically a vanilla in the first place. So I do think you are always first picking Massacre Girl. I would pick her over a lot of the premier removal spells in this set. I would definitely pick her over the 3-mana -5/-5 Omnix's Pigeon Cruelty or whatever it's called. And I think she's going to play out quite well. There are times where maybe she doesn't kill any creatures, but the body you get left behind is quite good too. Just note that she does affect all other creatures besides herself, not just your opponent. So there is some potential for her to kill a bunch of your own creatures, but you can kind of play around your own Massacre Girl. Maybe even build your deck in a way that Massacre Girl doesn't kill a lot of your own creatures, or maybe even include some 1 toughness creatures or 2 toughness creatures in your deck. That way they die and they can kind of increase the chain that Massacre Girl can deal with and maybe kill some of your opponent's creatures. It leads to some interesting deck design, but I think the overall effect here is a card that you're happy to first pick. Finale of Eternity is kind of insane. It's X black for a mythic sorcery. Destroy up to 3 target creatures with toughness X or less. What? Okay, if X is 10 or more, return all creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield. Whatever. You win the game super hard. Your opponent cries. They're like, oh, he cast Finality of Eternity for 12 mana and I lost. Like, yeah, that'll happen once, but for the most part, you cast this for X is less than 10, doesn't matter. You're probably still winning that game. X black, destroy 3 creatures? How many times do you see that on a card? Like, how many times do you see destroy 3 target creatures printed on a card? Thank God this is Mythic, because it is busted. This shouldn't be too hard to kill 3 good creatures, right? You pay, let's say, I don't know, 4. X is 4. That seems reasonable, right? As a good late game kind of finisher card, you get to destroy 3 of your opponent's creatures that have 4 toughness or less, and those are often going to be very relevant creatures. There's no way you're not first picking Finality of Eternity. It's one of the best cards in the set by far, rivaling even the gods, and I think this is going to be a little bit of a heartbreaker when it comes to sealed and draft. If you run into this, I'm sorry it happened to you, but please send me a screenshot of you reanimating your whole graveyard with this card. Like, that's even a necessary thing to do when you're blowing up 3 of your opponent's creatures. And then speaking of the gods, we have another busted mythic rare god. God Eternal Bontu is 3 black for a 5/6 menace. It's a mythic zombie god. It's legendary. It has the same god clause as the other ones we've seen, where it gets put 3rd from the top if it dies or it's exiled from the battlefield. And then the effect on this one says when it enters the battlefield, sacrifice any number of other permanents, then draw that many cards. So a nice way to turn extra lands or, kind of useless creatures into additional cards. Bontu has the potential to draw just a bunch of cards when it comes into play, and then on top of that, you're getting a 5/6 menace for 5. I literally just got through saying that I like Massacre Girl's stat line as a 4/4 menace for 5. Bontu's like, nah, let's make it a 5/6. And that's a lot of damage and very hard to block. And a lot of times you'll get in a situation where you have to double block Bontu and throw away 2 creatures to get it off board. And then Bontu will come back 3 turns later, maybe come down and even draw more cards. So it's kind of like this endless loop of value if you have expendable cards or extra lands to sacrifice. So yeah, Bontu, easy first pick, as are all the gods. You'll see with the next 2 colors that those gods are going to be in the top first picks as well. And yeah, all of these rares here are busted, with Massacre Girl being, a whole step down from Bontu and Finale of Eternity, but not by that much. You see a god, you see the black Finality, pick it, you'll be happy, your opponent will be sad, everything will work out. And that does it for black for War of the Spark. Next up, we'll be talking about red, a little bit of aggression, a little bit more amass, and we'll see how it pans out. So again, make sure you subscribe below if you're interested in seeing the rest of the series or our first couple drafts when this set drops on Arena, and find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. If I missed something with one of the cards, let me know in the comments below so I can correct that. And until next time, be tuned to the channel. We will have red up next, and I'll see you.